The air in Sham Shui Po doesn't just sit, it clings. It carries the heavy, humid scent of diesel exhaust, fermenting garbage, and the omnipresent, spicy steam from the noodle vats. My father was a master of that steam. For 30 years, I watched his back, a map of salt-stained cotton, as he pulled thin strands of flour into life. He was rhythmic, a machine of muscle and habit, until he wasn't. I remember the sound first. Not a scream, but a wet, rattling gasp. Then the clatter of a stainless steel ladle hitting the floor tiles. I turned just in time to see the light leave his eyes before his knees even hit the grease-slicked ground. The dinner rush didn't stop for him. Customers kept slurping, their faces buried in bowls, until my mother's shriek pierced the humid air, sharp enough to cut through the roar of the ventilation fans. In the hospital, the silence was worse than the noise of the shop. Queen Elizabeth Hospital smells of industrial bleach and dying hope. For 3 days, I sat on plastic chairs that felt like ice against my skin, watching doctors with tired eyes scribble on clipboards. Advanced liver failure, they said. The words sounded like a sentence, not a diagnosis. 800,000 Hong Kong dollars for the transplant, 6 months to live without it. I looked at my hands. They were stained with flour and scallion juice, calloused from carrying crates of bok choy. 800,000. We had 30,000 in a tin box under the floorboards. I was 19. I had no credit, no collateral, nothing but a back strong enough to work 16 hours a day for a father who was now yellowing like old parchment in a sterilized bed. My mother was already out, scrubbing the floors of skyscrapers in Central, her hands raw from lie, trying to earn cents against a mountain of debt. The darkness of the soul begins at 2 a.m. in a hospital cafeteria. The fluorescent lights hummed, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to grate against my very bones. I was staring into a cup of lukewarm tea, watching the steam vanish, when the chair across from me scraped against the linoleum. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like success. His suit was the color of a moonless night, perfectly tailored to a frame that suggested hidden strength. But it was the watch that caught the light. A gold Rolex, heavy and unapologetic. It represented more money than I would see in a decade of pulling noodles. He didn't speak at first. He just slid a thick manila envelope across the Formica tabletop. My fingers trembled as I opened it. I had never seen that much cash. Stacks of $1,000 bills, crisp and smelling of ink and power. Exactly 800,000. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Your father helped me once," the man said. His voice was like gravel shifting under a heavy tide, deep, calm, and dangerous. "A long time ago. I don't forget debts." Before I could find my voice, before I could ask who he was or how he knew, he stood up. The gold of his watch flashed one last time, and he was gone, melting into the shadows of the corridor. I sat there, clutching the paper weight of a miracle, feeling a cold knot of dread tightening in my gut. You don't get miracles in Sham Shui Po. You only get trades. The surgery worked. My father's skin lost its sickly hue. He breathed again. But the air in our shop felt different when I returned. 2 weeks later, the rhythm was broken. I was sliding the heavy metal shutters down for the night, the iron cold and gritty under my palms, when a black sedan pulled up. The same man stepped out. This time, he wasn't a guardian angel. He was followed by 3 men with dead eyes and necks thicker than my thighs. He sat at the very table where my father used to eat his shift meal. "The money wasn't a gift," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "It was a loan, and the interest on a life is steep." He didn't want the cash back. He wanted me. 3 years, he said. 3 years of service to the 14K, the oldest, most shadow-steeped triad in the territory. If I refused, he told me, with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather. He would take the liver back. He would walk into the hospital and undo the miracle. I looked at his hands. They were clean, manicured. I looked at my own. They were shaking. I nodded. There was no choice. There never is when you're poor. My life as a 49er, the lowest rung of the ladder, began on a street corner in Mong Kok. They gave me a burner phone and a single instruction: watch. I became a ghost in the neon-soaked rain. I stood for 8, 10, 12 hours, my shirt sticking to my back in the stifling heat, then shivering as the midnight breeze turned the sweat to ice. My job was binary. If I saw a blue uniform or a suspicious van, I sent a red circle emoji. That was it. I was a human tripwire. I didn't know what was behind the steel door I was guarding: a heroin den, a room full of kidnapped girls, or a high-stakes mahjong game where fortunes were lost in a night. I learned quickly that curiosity is a terminal illness in the 14K. You don't ask questions. You just watch the flow of the city, the way the light reflects off the wet asphalt, and you wait for the rot to claim you. After months of silence, they moved me to the warehouses. Logistics. I spent my nights unloading crates from unmarked trucks. Some were heavy, smelling of pungent chemicals that made my nose bleed. Others were light, the contents shifting with a hollow metallic clinking. I learned the language of the underworld not through words, but through the weight of things. I watched how the red poles, the enforcers, carried themselves with an earned arrogance. I watched how the money flowed upward, disappearing into the pockets of men who never touched the crates. Then came the first test of my silence. A raid. The screaming sirens, the blinding searchlights. I ran until my lungs burned, but a boot caught my heel in a narrow alleyway. The concrete tasted like copper and grit as I was slammed down. Handcuffs bit into my wrists. The cop was young, his face red with adrenaline. He screamed at me, threatened me with years in Stanley prison, whispered about how my mother would die alone while I rotted. I closed my eyes and pictured my father's face, healthy and smiling behind the noodle counter. I said nothing, not a word. The next day, my recruiter, the man with the Rolex, met me in a tea house. He didn't offer praise. He offered a promotion. "You're ready for the mountain," he said. The initiation was a descent into a nightmare of tradition. They blindfolded me and drove me through the winding guts of the city until I lost all sense of direction. When the cloth was ripped away, the smell of incense was so thick I could nearly chew it. We were in a hidden temple, the walls lined with the names of ancestors and the symbols of the Triad. 30 men stood in a circle, their faces carved out of shadow by flickering candles. In the center stood the dragon head. He looked 100 years old, his skin like cracked leather. He began to chant the 36 oaths. With every word, the air grew heavier. "If you betray your brothers, you will die by 1,000 cuts. If you help the police, your family will suffer." Each oath was a nail in the coffin of my former self. Then, the white rooster. I watched, paralyzed, as they slit its throat. The blood sprayed, hot and bright, into a porcelain bowl. They grabbed my hand, piercing my finger with a needle, until my own blood dripped into the bowl, swirling with the birds. "Drink," they commanded. The liquid was thick, metallic, and nauseatingly warm. As it slid down my throat, I felt a part of me die. I wasn't the son of a noodle maker anymore. I was a cell in a massive, ancient organism. There is no resigning from the 14K. There is only the debt, and the debt is eternal. By the time I was 24, I was no longer a watcher. I was a red pole. 426, an enforcer. My hands, once used to pull dough, were now trained to grip a lead pipe and a meat cleaver. The Sun Yeon, our rivals, had encroached on our territory in Tsimsha Tsui. They were stealing our face and our profit. The order was simple: shut them down. We hit the gambling den at midnight. I remember the sound of the door splintering, a dry, violent crack. The room was a blur of cigarette smoke and terrified faces. I didn't feel like a person. I felt like a storm. I swung the baton, feeling the sickening vibration travel up my arm as it met bone. People were screaming. Tiles were flying. The smell of sweat and terror was overwhelming. I found a rival enforcer reaching for a knife. I didn't hesitate. I broke his arm with a clinical precision that terrified me. We left as quickly as we came, disappearing into the labyrinth of alleys before the first siren could be heard. That night, I sat in my small apartment, staring at my knuckles. They were split and bruised. I thought about my father. He was probably sleeping, dreaming of the perfect broth. He had no idea that his life was being paid for in shattered teeth and broken ribs. I had saved him, yes, but every day I lived, I became something he would despise. I was a guardian of a legacy built on blood, and I was just getting started. By the time I turned 29, the calluses on my hands had shifted. They were no longer the rough, jagged marks of a street fighter, but the subtle, hidden tensions of a man who held a pen more often than a pipe. The dragonhead had seen the way I looked at the ledgers. While the other red poles were busy snorting the profits or blowing them on hostesses in Wan Chai, I was calculating the margins. I understood that violence is a tool, but numbers are the foundation. I was promoted to white paper fan, 415, the administrator, the architect of the invisible. My office was no longer a rain-slicked alleyway. It was a sleek, glass-walled room above a high-end karaoke bar in Causeway Bay. Below me, the city pulsed with a frantic, desperate energy. But up here, it was all silent air conditioning and the soft hum of servers. I became the ghost in the machine. My job was to take the black money, the filth from the heroin docks, the predatory interest from the loan sharks, the damp bills from the brothels, and make it white. I ran the washing machines. We owned a string of noodle shops, a nostalgic nod to my past that felt like a twisted joke. On paper, a shop with 10 stools was serving 500 people an hour. The cash registers rang with phantom sales, a rhythmic cha-ching that echoed the heartbeat of the Triad. I watched the dirty cash go into the till and saw it emerge as legitimate dividends, clean enough to buy property in the mid-levels. But the loan sharking was what sat heaviest in my stomach. I managed the books for the vampire accounts. I saw the names: a minibus driver borrowing to fix his engine, a mother of 3 borrowing for her son's tuition. The interest was 20% a month. It was a mathematical trap, a spiral that only ended in one of 2 ways: total submission or total destruction. When they couldn't pay, I was the one who sent the red poles. I didn't go myself anymore, but I was the one who signed the order. I was the one who dictated exactly how many fingers needed to be broken to ensure the next payment. I was earning $80,000 a month. I wore silk ties and ate abalone that cost more than my father's old shop earned in a week. I was a businessman. But every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the 19-year-old boy in the hospital cafeteria. I realized then that the 3-year debt they promised me was a lie. There is no expiration date on a soul. They didn't just want my time, they wanted my capacity for guilt to be burned away until nothing was left but the function. By 37, the transition was complete. I was named Incense Master. 438, the Keeper of the Flame. The world was changing. It was 2015, and the air in Hong Kong was thick with the scent of tear gas and rebellion. The youth were in the streets, holding umbrellas against the sun and the state. Inside the 14K, A different kind of revolution was happening. The old men, the ones who remembered the secret codes and the sacred rituals, were dying out. The new recruits, the Blue Lanterns, didn't care about the 36 oaths. They didn't care about the brotherhood or the blood of the rooster. They wanted crypto. They wanted fast cars. And they had no respect for the face of the elders. As incense master, I was the bridge. I stood in the dim light of secret temples, reciting the ancient poetry of the Triad to kids who were checking their social media feeds under their robes. I performed the blood rituals, feeling like a priest in a church whose God had long since departed. The old ways are the only ways that keep us from becoming common street thugs, I told them. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. I helped the Dragonhead pivot. We moved into the digital shadow. I recruited hackers from the dark web, skinny kids who could bleed a bank account dry without ever leaving their bedrooms. We traded cleavers for keystrokes, credit card fraud, identity theft, phishing scams. It was cleaner, quieter, and infinitely more profitable. Within 2 years, my cyber division was generating $50 million a year. I was a god of the new territories. My father had died the year before. He went peacefully, thinking his son was a successful import-export executive. He died proud of me. That was the greatest mercy and the deepest sting. My mother had grown quiet, her eyes following me with a suspicion she never dared to voice. My sister had fled to Toronto, changing her name and cutting all ties. She knew. She smelled the rot on my expensive suits. I had saved the family, but in doing so, I had become the thing they needed saving from. Then came the pinnacle. At 45, I stood in a mountain temple, the wind howling through the ancient cedars. The old Dragonhead was gone, consumed by the same cancer that tried to take my father, though no amount of money could buy him a second chance. 20 senior members knelt before me. I was crowned 489, the Dragonhead. I controlled 3,000 men. I was the final arbiter of life and death from Macau to Shenzhen. When I spoke, the markets shifted. When I frowned, men disappeared. I sat in private dining rooms in Central, sipping 50-year-old whiskey with government officials and tycoons. We were the shadow government, the invisible infrastructure that kept the city running when the laws failed. But the higher you climb, the thinner the air becomes. In 2019, the request came from across the border. Beijing didn't want a negotiation. They wanted an asset. They told me to mobilize my red poles. They wanted patriots to enter the subway stations and the protest lines to crack skulls. They wanted the movement to look like a riot so they could justify the iron fist. I saw the look in the eyes of my senior lieutenants. Some were eager for the blood. Others, the old school ones, looked away in shame. We were supposed to protect our people, not be the mercenaries of a distant master. But the choice was an illusion. Dragonheads who said no had a habit of being found in the harbor or ending up in a mainland prison on corruption charges. I gave the order. I watched the footage on the news, my men in white shirts, swinging sticks at students. I saw the blood on the tiles of the Yuen Long station. It was the same color as the rooster's blood from my initiation. But this time, it didn't feel sacred. It felt like the end. I had traded my father's life for my freedom, and now I was trading my city's soul for my survival. The reckoning didn't come from a rival gang. It came from the very hand that fed us. In 2020, the national security law fell like a guillotine. Beijing no longer needed a shadow, they wanted total light. The Triads were no longer useful assets, we were loose ends. Operation Iron Fist was surgical. They didn't knock. At 5 a.m., the windows of my penthouse shattered. 50 officers in tactical gear swarmed in. the red dots of their lasers dancing across my chest like fireflies. I didn't reach for a weapon. I just stood there, letting the cold metal of the handcuffs snap shut. It felt familiar. It felt like a debt finally being called in. The trial was a circus. The news called me the architect of terror. They had everything. Wiretaps, ledger entries I thought were encrypted, and testimony from the very lieutenants I had promoted. In the end, there is no loyalty in the dark, only the hope of a shorter sentence. The judge didn't blink as he read the verdict. Life. Now, I sit in Stanley Prison. The walls are thick, gray, and indifferent. I have 23 hours a day to think. I think about the humidity of the noodle shop. I think about the weight of that first envelope in the hospital cafeteria. I realize now that the man with the Rolex wasn't paying a debt to my father. He was buying a slave at a discount. I am 50 years old. I will die behind these bars. My father lived because of me, but I have no sons to carry my name, and no brothers left to burn incense at my grave. I climbed the ladder of the 14K until I touched the clouds, only to find that the ladder was made of bone, and the clouds were only smoke. In the silence of my cell, I can still taste it, the warm, metallic tang of the rooster's blood. It's the only thing I have left. The debt is finally paid, but there's nothing left of the man who owed it.